I mentioned in the March-April status update that I need a more systematic investigation of some of the factors affecting the establishment and survival of these terrariums. Since I started making these terrariums a year and a half ago, most of them have died, and in a variety of ways. The most successful terrariums have been the biggest ones, but of course those are also the most expensive and therefore not really a great choice for ad hoc experimentation. So what I really need is a way to experiment with these terrariums on a small scale in a repeatable enough way that I can tell whether the results mean anything. And of course I need a plan for what sort of things I want to try and what I'm trying to find out. I need a list of experiments, a test program. So that's what I've come up with. The list isn't super long so far, just 8 experiments, but it's a living document and the experiments themselves are not trivial. They mostly focus on basic factors affecting the survival of plants in a closed environment, with a particular focus on establishing new terrariums and on coping with the fairly extreme summers that we get here, since that seems to be the main driver of terrarium mortality that I've seen so far. 2 of these experiments have actually already begun, and in fact the seed germination study is complete. I'd like to go over those in their own videos, even if they aren't very long, so I won't discuss the results so far here, but I will just go over all the experiments in roughly the order that I plan to do them in. Number 1. The seed germination study. Many of the early terrariums died because the plants I put in them failed to establish themselves. Getting a plant through the small necks of the larger glass bottles I have is difficult to do without damaging the roots, and the wider mouthed jars are smaller overall and don't leave a lot of room for the plants to grow, which causes other problems later. In the second carboy terrarium, number 00306, and some of the refurbished terrariums, I tried something a little different by planting seeds instead of mature plants, and that seems to have worked really well in the carboy terrarium, but with mixed results in the smaller refurbished terrariums. I think the key issue is the number and viability of seeds in the soil I used to start the terrariums. In a big terrarium with a lot of soil, it's not a huge deal, but in the smaller ones it makes a lot of difference. So the purpose of this experiment is to go around my yard sampling the dirt that I used to start these terrariums off, and then just allow that to sprout in a favorable environment for a while and see what grows. By recording what parts of the yard the samples were taken from and using multiple samples from each site, I should be able to gain a rudimentary understanding of where the most viable seed earth is for starting these terrariums. Number 2, the 1.75 liter 6-month sustainability study. Most of these experiments are intended to be done on sealed terrariums of the type that I've been making so far. But how can I judge the outcome of an experiment if the baseline is a dead terrarium anyway? The purpose of this experiment is to establish a reliable terrarium design in a glass terrarium vessel that is abundant enough that I can use it for multiple experiments and multiple replicates. Namely, I want to use these 1.75 liter clear glass gin bottles, of which I have an awful lot. The experiment is simple. I'll set up several very basic terrariums with the most robust plant I have around and minor variations in the watering parameters, and simply monitor that for 6 months. If any of these terrariums can survive for the full 6 months, then they can at least survive long enough for me to do the other experiments I want to do with. Spoiler alert, I already started this experiment 3 months ago, and all of the terrariums are still alive in some form or other so far. Number 3. Fertilizer Test. The soil I've used so far has been pretty random. Mainly just clods of dirt from around the roots of the plants that I've put in the terrariums, occasionally some potting mix, and various attempts to gather dirt from a variety of places around my yard and mix them up. Although this experiment will not be an exhaustive study of soil factors by any means, it will attempt to begin to develop the tools for basic soil engineering in these terrariums by investigating fertilizer additives. This experiment will compare control terrariums with a basic, unamended soil to terrariums with various fertilizers added to it. My understanding is that usually adding fertilizer will kill a terrarium because there's no drainage and the built-up fertilizer either burns the plants or gets converted to salts in the soil. But there's always some amount of nutrient even in natural soil, and I suspect that the small amounts of fertilizer I want to add can be done without completely poisoning everything and salting the earth. Number 4. Water Test. This test will simply investigate the effects of different amounts of initial water supply in the terrarium. To a certain extent, the 6-month sustainability study is already doing this, but this study will explore a wider range of water supplies, i.e. very dry and completely waterlogged terrariums, and possibly more exotic water systems such as standing water areas in the terrarium and condensation devices. The amount of water in the terrarium is clearly a very important factor in terrarium design and has been a subject of concern since the very start of this project. I've developed a rule of thumb so far of about 1 tablespoon to half a tablespoon of water per liter of terrarium volume. But that rule of thumb has also prevented me from experimenting with significantly wetter or drier terrarium environments, and this experiment will directly address that blind spot. Number 5. Shade test. This is another test that is sort of being done in an ad hoc way already. This test will compare various shade devices to see how they affect the ability of a terrarium to survive the summer heat and sun here in San Antonio. The rehabilitated 00101 and 00102 terrariums are already behind a sunshade, and one of them, 00101, seems to be surviving the summer. Most promisingly, it's only surviving in the shaded part of the terrarium. The part that's exposed to the sun is already baked and dead. This fairly dramatic result suggests that shading devices of various kinds, such as layered shades, translucent shades, silvered or tinted glass terrariums, or partially opaque terrariums, may significantly change the results of the terrarium project. Number 6. Activated carbon test. Nearly every terrarium tutorial on the internet tells you to put activated carbon in the substrate, usually right above the false bottom. The carbon absorbs pollutants and helps to keep the terrarium water clean and avoid poisoning the ecosystem contained within. I have generally omitted this step for 2 reasons. First, I am too lazy to go to the fish store and buy activated carbon, and second, because the filtration effect of the carbon is a one-way process. The activated carbon absorbs pollutant well at first, until it eventually reaches its capacity and can absorb no more, after which it ceases to have any effect. Some things, such as heating it, can cause the activated carbon to release whatever it has absorbed, replenishing its purification capacity, but the released material, i.e. the pollutants the carbon was placed in the terrarium to absorb in the first place, are reintroduced to the terrarium when this occurs. So my reasoning has been that in the long run, the activated carbon should have no effect on a sealed terrarium, since it will either become inert, or else whatever it absorbs will eventually be re-released anyway. However, I have not put this to the test. Perhaps the absorbed materials are able to chemically react whilst bound to the carbon and form some more benign form. Perhaps the carbon can simply act as an atmospheric battery, stabilizing terrarium's atmosphere and hydrosphere and providing a more hospitable environment. This experiment will compare identical terrariums with and without activated carbon in them to determine its impact on the living conditions within. Number 7. Plant Varieties Test. This is less a single test than a long ongoing series of tests. This will seek to determine the best selections of plants for various terrarium environments and outcomes by placing a small number of untried plant species within an otherwise well-understood terrarium environment and evaluating their performance, both in terms of the plant's health and its impact on its surroundings over time. Since there are a nearly unlimited number of plant species on this earth, there are obviously more plants that I can try in a terrarium than I will ever get to in my lifetime, barring some unforeseen breakthrough in longevity medicine. Consequently, this will be an ongoing test program with an indefinite duration. Number 8. Cold Trap Test. Related to the shade tests, this is an idea I had for a passive device that would cool the terrarium by providing an attached upper air bulb into which hot air could flow, radiate heat away, and then fall back into the terrarium. The results should produce a cooler terrarium environment, relatively speaking, by improving heat rejection in the summer. This can further be generalized to various kinds of heat control devices relying on the relative placement of the inhabited areas of the terrarium relative to the glass, such as valleys or sloped areas that may provide shelter during the winter by reducing or enhancing radiative heat losses and making use of trapped air in the terrarium to create hot and cold regions. Multi-lobed terrarium designs, alternative terrarium shapes, and various internal gadgets may also be included in an extended version of this test. But, at its most basic, this test will probably take the form of a basic control terrarium and an identical terrarium with a wine bottle attached above the neck with sealant and a metal support armature. There's probably a lot of other things I could look at, but these are just the ones that struck out as me as obviously needing further investigation. If anyone watches this video and has any ideas for other tests, please feel free to tell me. There's definitely more that needs to be understood before I can move on to the next phase of terrarium development, but I think that this test program will really help to get there from where I am now.